this week's episode of Art Like Everything Else, the podcast where I use art to talk about literally everything else. I'm your host, Mo, and this week I wanted to talk about exactly what the title says, doing the world's work. Now, you may be wondering what I mean by that, and before we hop into our full-blown conversation, I'm more or less talking about the idea of doing the work that the world uses to oppress you and to make you feel bad for the world itself. Now, I do plan to elaborate a bit more on that in today's conversation, but before we get to today's conversation, I want to talk about two works of art that I use to help sort of further discuss this idea. So let's hop into our first work of art so we can have today's conversation. So for today's work of art, I'm talking about the movie Chocolat. So this movie is based on a screenplay by the same name, written by Robert Nelson Jacobs. And so the movie was directed by Lasse Hallström. And so the movie also an additional writer, Joanne Harris. But this movie it was actually pretty good. Like, I was surprised to have enjoyed it so much. I've been more or less just like picking movies at random to watch recently, and so when this one kind of popped up, I was pleasantly surprised. But I felt like this movie also fit perfectly into the conversation that I wanted to have for our conversation today, which is about doing the world's work. So before we get into discussing how this movie sort of relates to that conversation, I do want to briefly tell you about the movie without any spoilers. Without too many spoilers. So because of the nature of this very podcast is sort of discussing movies, films, songs, and different works of art and how it relates to whatever conversation we're having at hand, it is going to require some delving into the details of what's happening in these pieces of work. And so I try my best to not disclose every single little thing that happens in whatever it is that I'm discussing, so that you can go back and watch it and it not feel like you pretty much know everything already. So with that being said, I will give you a description of the movie per IMDb, and then feel free to go and watch the movie and come back, or to tough it out, listen to the movie, because like I said, I'm not going to give you beat by beat of everything that happens in the movie. I am just going to kind of talk briefly about quite a few of the characters and how they relate to today's conversation. So with that being said, per IMDb, Chocolat is about a single mother, Vianne Rocher, and her young daughter arrive in a rural French town in the winter of 1959 and open an unusual chocolate shop that disrupts the moral fiber of the strictly Catholic townsfolk and mayor. And so it is exactly as I said. That is definitely what happens in the movie. And honestly, there's so much more. So something I wanted to discuss and kind of talk about and how this movie relates to today's conversation. So kind of like how we just heard in the description of the movie, this single mother is showing up in this Catholic town, this Catholic small rural town in 1959. And as you can imagine, a single mother in a Catholic town stands out. And so she's not one that goes with the flow of things. And the expectation, if you're going to live in this town, is to go with the flow of what is expected of you and whatever role it is that you play. And we see that sort of play out among many of the characters in this movie. We have the mayor, Comte de Renard, we have Josephine, we have Armand. We have so many characters who we see this sort of doing the world's work, sort of inhabiting them because as a result of living and existing in this town. And the ways in which the world and the environment around you will conspire almost to force you into your own oppression. And we see that happen with characters like our mayor, Comte de Renard, who is so obsessed with keeping what he considers to be order in this town that he quite literally ghostwrites the sermons for the church. And not only do he ghostwrite these sermons, everyone in that town is expected to go to church every Sunday. Like, there's no, like, you're not supposed to be someone who doesn't attend church. Like, it's like, oh, you're wrong and you are the crazy one. And then we see that also happen with a character like Josephine, in which, like, the life she is living and existing in does not make her happy. She's in an unhappy marriage and she can't cook. And because she's not fitting what the world, especially this town, is telling her she's supposed to fit in her role as a woman, she's made to be or seem like she's crazy or out of her mind. And it's ridiculous. There's a lot that goes on in this movie, but it was refreshing in that, like, just because it's a movie from the 2000s, there was so much that sort of just like kept happening that kept me enthralled for it to be 2 hours and a movie from the 2000s. And so I thought that was really cool and really nice. But with that being said, I don't want to have our full conversation on this movie alone. I want to talk about our next work of art so we can have our full blown conversation. With that being said, let's hop into our next work of art. For our next work of art, I'm going to be talking about the movie Wreck-It Ralph. This movie was directed and written by Rich Moore. It was also written by Phil Johnson and Jennifer Lee, and this movie was released in 2012. So for those who have not watched the movie, I'm going to read you a brief description from IMDb, and then after that, I'm going to get to talking and discussing some parts of the movie that will pertain to today's conversation. So with that being said, per IMDb, Wreck-It Ralph is about Ralph is tired of playing the role of a bad guy and embarks on a journey to become a video game hero. But he accidentally lets loose a deadly enemy that threatens the entire arcade. And so, yeah, that's what the movie is about. And I want to specifically talk about, if you've seen the movie, we know about Ralph, who's our main character, and there's another semi-main character by the name of Penelope. And so, in this movie, we see them on this venture to help get them their respective things that they desire so that they are not on the outskirts of their societies, in the sense. So, like, Penelope is trying to get the chance to at least be able to participate in a race, because everyone is saying she's not allowed to participate in a race because she's seen as infected. And then we have Ralph, who is seen as a bad guy, and all he wants is to be acknowledged, have a home. He wants to exist and not feel like garbage, essentially. Like, his home is literally the dump, and he's having to watch and see everyone else in his game celebrating with each other, being happy and communing with each other, and he's always on the outskirts and just all by his lonesome. And he just doesn't want to be by his lonesome anymore. But how does that relate to today's conversation? I'm glad you asked. So we're talking about not doing the world's work. And so we see how with both of these characters, and honestly with you could argue with a few other characters in this movie as well, they are almost forced into taking on the idea of like this self-oppression and believing what other people are saying about them, or believing or being tricked into or forced to believe that they are only ever allowed to be one way. And that's not the case. Like, you're allowed to change, you're allowed to grow, or you're allowed to be different, but it's hard to do that when the world is teaching you and fortifying you into doing the work it wants to do for you so that it's easier on them. And so yes, we see that with our characters in this movie, and them having to engage with the world around them, telling them to believe otherwise about themselves. And I want to elaborate on what doing the world's work might look like, or what it is, in today's conversation. So let's hop right on over and have today's conversation. So what inspired today's episode was a quote from James Baldwin, and that quote reads, "It's not the world that was my oppressor, because what the world does to you, if the world does it to you long enough and effectively enough, you begin to do it to yourself." And that quote in and of itself inspired today's episode of doing the world's work. Because yes, the world does tell you how to oppress yourself. It teaches you the ways in which you are supposed to view yourself so that you think less of yourself, the ways in which you are supposed to engage in the world so that you do not feel confident or capable in your own abilities. And it forces you to put yourself under the microscope so that you can oppress and you can force yourself into the box it lays out for you. And it's often in little, very, very little ways. So we can see in the movie Wreck-It Ralph, Penelope, despite existing in this game, she is told that, like, you are not supposed to be here, you are not allowed to exist, and you are not allowed to participate in anything that it is we have going on in this game. And so we see that in every time she tries to participate or hang out with the characters in her game, they're mean to her, they're bullying her, and it gets to her. Like, she doesn't show it gets to her often, but it does get to her, and she does start to. She's just like, I just exist like this, and I don't get to do things like everyone else. Like I'm just like this little homeless man who found this cave in this secret glitched out part of the game, and it's like you can see her more or less settling into this role that the world she exists in has set for her, because the world has taught her to oppress herself. We see the same especially in the movie Chocolat, in which, like, prior to Vienne coming to this town, we see these people more or less just trudging through their lives and existing how they are expecting and being told to exist in regards to the city and the Catholic town that they're living in. So we have Josephine, who, despite being in a terrible marriage, despite being somewhere she doesn't want to be, she feels like she's the crazy one because she's not happy being married. She's, especially with her partner, she's not happy, and she's seen and told that she's crazy and no one believes her. And so, like, she starts to act and be more or less crazy. And it's almost like this self-fulfilling prophecy in that, like, she's being made to feel like she's crazy. And so, as a result, she's crazy, or she's doing things that would make her seem crazy or out of her mind. And we see the mayor also, who, despite being in charge of the town, he is also beholding himself to very specific values that he believes he has to live by because he's the mayor and because he comes from a long line of mayors. And so anything he sees as morally disruptive, he seeks to get rid of it or try to damage it in the way he tried to damage Vienne. It's because of this, like, moral prison that he's placed himself in and that he's placed the townsfolk in, that you can see a lot of these characters do feel suffocated in a way that they feel they are allowed to exist and allowed to be. We have these people existing in this town, telling themselves and forcing themselves into these prisons because that's what the society they are living in has been telling them that they have to do their entire lives, essentially. And so when Vienne does come, and she's just like, oh, yeah, no, I don't care about that. And, like, she's this free spirit, it opens and invites them into wanting to try something different, wanting to be and do something different, or be even open to the idea of doing something different. So something I think also it will be really important for today's conversation is not only thinking about the ways in which the world wants us to oppress ourselves and the steps it takes to do so, but also thinking about the roles in which we take up in said oppression, even if it's of those around us. So it's like, yes, the world is telling us to oppress ourselves. The world is telling us that we must exist and be and live and desire in a very specific way. But sometimes, because we've been indoctrinated, or we feel the desire or the need to condemn anything that does not look like that. And so we see that in both movies. We see that in Wreck-It Ralph with the characters in Penelope's game, Sugar Rush, that were condemning and essentially bullying Penelope for wanting to exist as everyone else does in this game. And then we also see it in Chocolat, in which everyone, quite, when I say quite literally, the mayor was quite literally ghostwriting sermons for the church that was demonizing anything seen as, like, morally corrupt, which was Vienne the chocolatier. Like, spoiler, but if you're gonna go watch the movie, like, there's more to see that movie. But, like, one of the sermons he ghostwrites, he literally says, well, not literally, he essentially says, like, oh yeah, and going to the chocolatier lady is morally corrupt. Like, you shouldn't do that. It's like, what? You're using the church to get your licks off? Wild. But it's exactly like that. Like, he is holding himself to be the arbiter and the decider of what is and isn't okay in this town, despite him also being imprisoned and oppressed by the very same thing. So in this movie, we also see that he is struggling with coming to terms with the fact that he was not able to maintain a happy marriage. And we see that in the way that he lies to everyone he meets about whether or not his wife has come back. Like right for for pretty much the entirety of the movie, he's telling everyone, "Oh yeah, my wife is just visiting Italy. Like she's just visiting. She'll be back soon." Like not wanting to admit to himself that his marriage did not work out. And because he didn't want to admit to himself that, because he felt such shame in that, he wanted to almost go even harder in trying to uphold the morality of the rest of the townsfolk and wanting to dictate and tell them what is and is not okay. He takes it upon himself to be the arbiter of what is and is not moral and who is and is not allowed to exist in a very specific way in his town. And it's just, you see that happening with not only you being oppressing, like you oppressing yourself, but sometimes because you've oppressed yourself or you found yourself in this little dichotomy between you and the world telling you what to do and how to be, you are often doing it to other people. And so, with that being said, I want to talk a bit about the major tools used to oppress you and to force you into oppressing yourself. And one of the major tools used for that is shame and loneliness and isolation. And we see that in both of these movies. We see that prior to Vienne coming to this small town, anyone who was not, there was one old lady, Armand, who did not go to church regularly. And she was essentially on the outskirts of the town, that like people were not going out of their way to hang out with her or to be with her or to be around her, including her daughter and like grandson. And so we see her having to exist and be isolated and alone in this small rural town where it's like there's already not a lot of people in this town. And then we also see the same sort of happening in Wreck-It Ralph, in which Penelope, even despite being surrounded by all of those characters, she is forced into isolation because no one wants to be around her. And so it forces you to also kind of start to to think about and be like, oh, maybe I am all that they say I am. Or maybe if I could just fix myself, I would be able to be around them and do what it is that they do. When you're unable to fix yourself to make yourself able, like what would be considered okay to be around them, what then? You're oppressing yourself, and it's a lot of just self-inflicted harm. And so we use isolation, and they also use shame. And so we see in Chocolat, Josephine she felt a lot of shame about being considered not capable or not able to fit what was the role of a woman in the movie. And so like to be a proper wife, you had to be able to cook, you had to be able to clean, you had to not desire to have a life of your own. You had to want to have children. And so despite her not wanting any of that, and she was married, she was made to feel like she was crazy, out of her mind essentially, for wanting or not desiring what it is she was told she was supposed to desire. And we see her pretty much crazy because she's shamed and no one wants to hang around her because she's not fulfilling these duties, which leads back to the isolation. And she's also harboring this shame for not living up to the expectations of the world around her. And it's really sad. Yeah, it's like the shame and the isolation are very big tools of how they teach us and how they expect us to fall in line, essentially, of what it is they are telling us to be and how it is they are telling us to live. But all in all, what exactly can be done about this will probably be the next question. And I think in that regard, you have to be the person who's kind of willing to just say, I really kind of don't give a fuck. And let that kind of be it. Because the truth of the matter is, so in Chocolat, the reason we see Josephine sort of start to find a light within herself again was because Vienne showed up and was like, oh, yeah, no, you're cool people. I'm cool people. We should hang out. And we see Penelope also sort of start to perk back up and feel like a person and character again because Ralph showed up and it was like, oh, yes, we've had our ups and downs, but you're actually pretty cool and I can help you. And so it's important to find the people who are doing the work to stop doing the world's work and impressing themselves and oppressing other people. And it's important that we be intentional about that. And not just intentional about finding those people, but intentional about trying to become those people as well. And so we see in Chocolat the ways in which Vianne, just by showing up, just by being herself, and moving the way it is she's moved, she's encourages and inspires so many people in this town to also start to sort of think for themselves and believe and aspire to their own moral freedom in regards to the way they've been living, and that you can see life sort of start coming back to these folks. And then we also see the ways in which in Rick and Ralph, Penelope starts to come back to herself with the assistance of Ralph. And he also, in turn, starts to come back to himself because, again, he was also isolated and doing the work of his world telling him that he's worthless essentially and finding value in himself in his the ways in which he's engaging with and helping this other person. And so we are more than capable of putting in the work to stop doing what is expected of us, especially by the world, and we can keep doing that and stop doing the world's work and create and build ourselves in a way that will go against what it is we are being expected to oppress ourselves about or oppress ourselves with. But yeah, maybe, just maybe, not doing the world's work too can be an art. An art like everything else. And certainly not least is today's Awe Moment. So for those new, the Awe Moment is simply Art of the Week that made me think. And so this week's episode, I wanted to talk about the song that more or less inspired today's episode because it reminded me of the James Baldwin quote. And so that song is Free Up Something by Overcast. And so the song quite literally starts with the James Baldwin quote I read earlier about the ways in which the oppressor it does it long enough that it essentially teaches you how to oppress yourself. And as I was listening to that, because the song itself is essentially talking about how he wants to stop doing the world's work. He wants to do what he can to set himself apart, to be set apart from what it is that is expected of him and oppressing himself. And he wants to try to live his life to the fullest and do what he can to live how it is he desires to live and be able to express himself how he desires to express himself. And it was just really, it reminded me also of another tweet I believe I read somewhere by Mitski that was essentially was like, this isn't like word for word or anything, but I remember reading something like this some time back. It was like, it's mighty convenient of me to want to like not be here in a world that is essentially telling me to not be here or wants me to not be here. And so like I think in so many ways people have picked up on the fact that like there really is an idea of get with it or get lost placed on us by society. And so we start to oppress ourselves because, of course, people are communal in nature. And so if the expectation is that, like, in order for you to have community, you have to exist and abide by the world, that will include accepting the oppression of the world and inflicting that on yourself in order for you to fit in or order for you to be considered to be a part of what that world that exists. And so sometimes it takes existing outside of that and not letting the world oppress you or tell you to oppress yourself and accepting that as okay. It takes doing all of that in order to move past and in order to keep going and pursuing the life that it is you want to live. That is one, not taking on the work of the world telling you to oppress yourself. And so, yeah, that was what inspired today's episode. If you like what you heard, or if you have any ideas or thoughts that came to mind that you would like to share, feel free to drop those in the comments. Feel free to follow me on social media. You can follow my personal page, you can follow the Art Like Studios page, and you can follow my collective. So definitely do those things. Keep up to date with all that's kind of going on. And yeah, thank you for listening. Thank you for being. Have a great rest of your day. Bye.